The night she left, she didn't cry, didn't raise her voice, didn't even look particularly conflicted, which somehow made it worse than if she had screamed at me or thrown something against the wall. She stood in the doorway with a small overnight bag, keys already in her hand, and said she needed space in a tone so calm it felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in front of a mirror until the words lost their sharp edges. I asked where she was going, already knowing the answer because certainty sometimes arrives before logic, and she hesitated just long enough to confirm it. "Next door," she said, like it was nothing, like proximity somehow made betrayal more efficient. There was no fight to anchor the moment, no explosion that would let me tell myself this was about heat or impulse or something that burned out quickly. She didn't accuse me of neglect or boredom or lack of sex, didn't bring up any long list of grievances she'd been collecting in silence. She just said she was done pretending, that things felt clearer to her now, and that she didn't want to drag it out. The word clearer echoed in my head long after she turned away, because clarity is supposed to feel clean, not like someone just rearranged your life while you were still standing in it. I watched her walk across the small strip of lawn separating our houses, the same path I'd crossed 100 times carrying groceries or waving to neighbors, and the absurdity of it all landed hard. She wasn't disappearing into some unknown future. She was relocating 10 steps away, close enough that I could still smell her shampoo on the air if the windows were open. The door next door closed behind her with a soft click, not even loud enough to justify the heaviness settling into my chest. Later that night, after the shock wore off, and the house felt too quiet without her moving through it, I stood by the window and watched lights flick on in the place beside mine. A living room lamp, then a bedroom glow, each one feeling like a signal meant specifically for me. I wondered where she was sitting, whether she was nervous or relieved, whether the sex they'd inevitably have would feel like victory or just confirmation. The thought made my stomach twist, desire and resentment tangling in a way that felt humiliating, because part of me still wanted her even as she replaced me within arm's reach. I replayed our last weeks together, searching for signs I'd ignored, moments when her touch had felt slightly distracted, or when sex had seemed more about routine than hunger. Had she already been comparing bodies, reactions, the way he touched her versus the way I did? The questions piled up without answers, and the lack of a dramatic ending made it impossible to pin the pain to a single moment. This wasn't a rupture. It was a transfer, clean and efficient, like she'd simply updated her address and left me with the old version of her life. Sometime after midnight, I heard laughter drift through the thin air between the houses, not loud enough to be invasive but clear enough to register. It carried that casual intimacy people have when they think they're unobserved, and I felt a flash of anger at how ordinary it sounded. Betrayal, I was learning, doesn't always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it moves quietly, politely, and leaves you standing in the aftermath trying to understand how replacement can feel so seamless. I went to bed alone that night, the sheets still warm with memory, and stared at the ceiling while the house next door pulsed with light and sound. I told myself this was just the beginning, that things would make sense later, that proximity didn't mean permanence. But even then, watching the glow spill through unfamiliar windows, I understood how thin the wall really was between the life I thought I had and the one that had just moved on without me. The morning after she left, the neighborhood felt different, like I'd stepped into a version of it where everyone knew something I didn't. I noticed it first in small ways. The way Mrs. Keller across the street lingered a little too long while pretending to water her plants, her eyes flicking toward my house and then, inevitably, to the one beside it. When I stepped outside to get the mail, she smiled with a softness that didn't belong to casual politeness, the kind reserved for condolences you don't quite know how to offer without admitting you're already informed. By the time I drove to work, the realization settled in fully. This hadn't happened quietly. People had seen her carrying boxes across the lawn, had watched her disappear through the door next door with a confidence that suggested this wasn't a last-minute decision. The humiliation didn't come from being left. It came from understanding that my private collapse had been a public event, witnessed, cataloged, and quietly discussed over coffee and fences before I'd even processed it myself. That afternoon, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me as I was unloading groceries, making awkward small talk before casually mentioning how nice it was that my ex had found somewhere so close, as if proximity were a kindness instead of a blade twisted slowly. I nodded, muttered something non-committal, and felt my face heat with the effort of holding myself together. Every word like that landed with surgical precision, cutting without drama, reminding me that replacement had been efficient enough to look intentional. The worst part was the speculation, the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air. I could feel people wondering how long it had been going on, whether the sex had started before she moved, whether I'd been oblivious or simply tolerated until a better option presented itself. No one asked outright, of course, but curiosity has a way of leaking through tone and posture. I found myself replaying the last few months, interrogating every late night, every distracted touch, every time sex had felt more routine than urgent, and wondering if everyone else had seen the shift before I did. Even the mundane errands became loaded. At the corner store, the cashier glanced at me, then out the window toward the houses, recognition flashing briefly across her face. I realized how small our world was, how easily stories traveled when geography did half the work for you. Betrayal, when it happens next door, doesn't need explanation. It announces itself simply by existing in plain view. That evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I saw them together for the first time without walls in between. They were standing outside, laughing about something trivial, bodies angled toward each other with an ease that made my stomach tighten. She looked relaxed, lighter than she had in weeks, and the sight hit harder than I expected. This wasn't secrecy or stolen moments. This was daylight confidence. The humiliation sharpened then, not because she was happy, but because she was happy where everyone could see it. I went inside without acknowledging them, my chest tight with a mix of anger and something dangerously close to desire, because attraction doesn't always shut off when dignity demands it. That contradiction made everything feel messier, more exposed. I poured a drink I didn't really want, and sat by the window as the evening settled, watching silhouettes move behind the curtains next door, aware that at least some of the neighborhood was probably doing the same. The betrayal felt less emotional and more calculated the longer I sat with it, like a procedure performed with minimal blood loss but maximum efficiency. She hadn't blown up our life. She'd transitioned out of it, leaving me to absorb the impact while everyone else adjusted seamlessly. Being the last person to know wasn't just painful, it was isolating. A quiet acknowledgement that whatever we'd had, it hadn't been protected in the way I'd believed. By the time night fell, I understood that the humiliation wasn't something that would pass quickly. It was woven into the geography now, into glances and half smiles, into the simple act of stepping outside my own door. I wasn't just grieving a relationship. I was navigating a public narrative I hadn't agreed to, one that made my private loss visible and oddly communal. And standing there, listening to the neighborhood settle into sleep, I realized that whatever came next, it wouldn't happen in isolation. Too many eyes were already watching. I met her without knowing who she was, which in hindsight feels almost merciful, because if I'd understood the connection right away, I might have shut down before the moment had a chance to matter. It happened on a Saturday morning when I escaped the house just to avoid staring at the windows next door again. I went to a small cafe a few blocks away, the kind of place where nobody rushes you and the noise feels intentional, and I was standing at the counter when she commented on the book I was holding, something dry and observational that suddenly felt too on the nose for my life. She smiled when she spoke, not flirtatious, just open, curious, and there was an ease to her presence that disarmed me immediately. We started talking the way strangers sometimes do when there's no pressure to impress, just a shared moment and nowhere else to be. She was sharp, noticed details, asked questions that showed she was actually listening instead of waiting for her turn to talk. I told her more than I intended, not the full story, but enough for the weight I'd been carrying to shift slightly. We ended up sitting together, coffee cooling between us as conversation stretched longer than expected. She laughed easily but didn't fill silence for the sake of it, and there was something grounding about that, about not feeling like I had to perform normalcy. I noticed her hands as she talked, expressive but controlled, and caught myself registering the pull of attraction before reminding myself how raw everything still was. Desire doesn't disappear just because timing is terrible. At some point, the conversation drifted toward relationships. Not directly, just in that sideways way people use when they're feeling each other out. I admitted I'd just gone through something abrupt, something that left me questioning how much of my life had been real. She didn't offer platitudes or rush to reassure me. She just nodded, like she understood the shape of that kind of loss. That reaction alone felt like relief. It wasn't until she mentioned her brother casually, referencing a move he'd made recently, that the air shifted. She said his street, my street, and the coincidence landed hard enough to make my stomach drop. I asked her his name, already knowing the answer, and when she said it, there was no denying it anymore. She saw the recognition on my face immediately, the way my posture changed, and she went still, realization passing through her expression with a softness that surprised me. "I know who you are," she said quietly, not accusing, not defensive, just acknowledging the truth as it stood between us. I waited for judgment, for discomfort, for her to pull back, but she didn't. Instead, she asked if I was okay, and the simplicity of that question nearly unraveled me. I nodded, lied automatically, then laughed under my breath because the lie felt pointless in that moment. She told me she was sorry, not on behalf of her brother, not to smooth things over, but because she understood what it meant to be displaced so suddenly. She didn't defend him, didn't offer explanations meant to soften the blow, and that absence of justification created a space where honesty could exist without pressure. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I hadn't realized was constant until it eased. We talked longer after that, more carefully now, aware of the lines but not afraid of them. There was a subtle shift in the energy, a deeper attention, and beneath it all, a quiet current of attraction that neither of us acknowledged directly. It wasn't sexual in a blatant way, more like awareness, the recognition of another person's presence as something significant rather than incidental. When we finally stood to leave, the moment lingered awkwardly, neither of us quite ready to end it. She hesitated, then said, if I ever needed to talk, really talk, I could reach out. She wrote her number down without ceremony, sliding it across the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. Walking home afterward, the neighborhood felt different again, but this time not hostile or suffocating. For the first time since my girlfriend had walked out that door, I felt less alone inside the situation, less like the only person carrying the weight of it. I didn't know what the connection meant yet, didn't let myself imagine where it could go, but I knew one thing with certainty. She'd listened without minimizing, without rewriting, and in the middle of everything I'd lost, that felt like rescue. I didn't hear from her for a couple of days after the cafe, and I told myself that was fine, that whatever that moment had been, it didn't need to turn into something more just because it had felt grounding. Still, when my phone buzzed with her name late one evening, my body reacted before my thoughts caught up. A small, unwelcome rush of anticipation that reminded me how starved I'd been for uncomplicated connection. Her message was simple, asking if I wanted to walk, no pressure, no subtext spelled out, and I said yes before I could overthink it. We met at a small park not far from our street, neutral ground that felt intentionally chosen. The evening air was cool enough to justify jackets, and we walked side by side without touching, the space between us noticeable but not uncomfortable. For a while we talked about inconsequential things, work, books, the kind of conversation people use to test the edges before stepping closer to something real. Eventually, without drama, she asked how I was holding up, and this time I didn't lie. I told her about the silence in my house, about watching lights turn on next door, about the strange humiliation of realizing how many people had known before I did. I didn't soften it or try to sound detached, and she didn't interrupt. She listened with an attention that felt deliberate, her expression serious but not pitying, and when I finished, she exhaled slowly, like she'd been carrying something too. She told me then that what happened hadn't been sudden, that she'd seen the shift long before the move, The way her brother talked about my ex with a certainty that suggested planning, not impulse. She said she'd questioned it, had asked uncomfortable questions that didn't get comfortable answers, and that she hadn't agreed with how it was handled. The words landed carefully, not as ammunition but as context, and hearing them reframed everything in a way that was both painful and clarifying. What struck me most was what she didn't do. She didn't defend him, didn't minimize my experience, didn't ask me to understand things from their perspective. She acknowledged the damage plainly, without trying to balance it against intentions or convenience. That honesty created a quiet intimacy between us, a sense of alignment I hadn't felt in weeks, and I became acutely aware of her presence, the warmth of her body beside mine, the way attraction can bloom even in the middle of grief. There were pauses in our conversation that felt charged, not awkward, just full, moments where the air seemed to thicken with things neither of us was ready to name. I noticed how she glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking, the curiosity there unguarded, and I wondered if she felt the same pull, the same confusion of timing and desire. The restraint between us wasn't absence, it was intention, and that made it feel heavier. She admitted that taking my side had already caused friction, that her refusal to play along with the narrative had been noted, and that she didn't regret it. She said some lines matter more than family loyalty, and the steadiness with which she said it made something shift inside me. For weeks, I'd felt like my loss was being smoothed over for the sake of convenience, and here was someone willing to let it be what it was, without editing. As we turned back toward our starting point, neither of us in a hurry to end the walk, I realized how different this felt from the chaos I'd been living in. There was no urgency, no need to define what we were doing, just two people standing in a shared truth without trying to control the outcome. When we finally stopped, the moment lingered, a silence thick with possibility and restraint, and I could feel how easily it could tip into something else if either of us pushed. She didn't. Instead, she said she was glad we talked, that I didn't deserve to feel erased. And then she smiled, softer this time, the kind of smile that carries understanding without invitation. We stood a second longer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, subtle and unfamiliar, and the awareness of that closeness sent a quiet spark through me that I didn't try to extinguish. Walking home alone afterward, I felt something I hadn't expected so soon: steadiness. Not hope exactly, and not relief, but the grounding sense that my experience had been acknowledged without negotiation. Sides had been taken, not loudly or dramatically, but with integrity, and that changed the landscape of everything. Whatever came next, I knew I wasn't standing in it alone anymore, and that knowledge made the thin wall between my old life and the next feel just a little less oppressive. She didn't tell me all at once, and I'm glad for that, because I don't think I could have absorbed it in one clean blow. The truth came out slowly, in pieces, the way you uncover rot by pressing gently on wood that already looks compromised. We were sitting in her car one evening, parked a block away from the street we both now avoided when possible, the engine off, windows cracked, the quiet between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. She stared at the steering wheel for a long moment before speaking, like she was deciding whether honesty was worth the fallout it would cause. She told me the move hadn't been impulsive, not a sudden rush of emotion or a dramatic leap fueled by sex and proximity. It had been planned, discussed, timed carefully to minimize mess. My girlfriend and her brother had talked logistics before she ever packed a bag, had mapped out the transition so there'd be no overlap that required explanation, no drawn-out confrontation where feelings might complicate things. They'd wanted it clean, efficient. The word made my stomach drop. I asked how long, my voice steady in a way that surprised me, and she hesitated before answering, clearly choosing accuracy over comfort. Long enough, she said, that the ending of my relationship had been scheduled before I ever sensed it was ending. Long enough that my role had shifted from partner to placeholder without anyone bothering to tell me. Hearing that reframed every quiet moment I'd replayed in my head, every instance of distance I'd blamed on stress or routine, and the realization settled in cold and precise. She told me she'd known about the plan before it happened, not because she approved, but because she'd been pulled into it as a witness. She said she'd argued against it, told her brother it was cruel to orchestrate someone's displacement like a move on a chessboard, but he'd dismissed her concerns as emotional noise. They'd convinced themselves they were avoiding drama, when really they were avoiding accountability. The calm certainty my ex had carried when she left suddenly made sense, and that understanding hurt more than confusion ever had. What hit hardest wasn't anger, but the clarity of being managed. This hadn't been about passion overriding reason. It had been about control overriding consent. My girlfriend hadn't just chosen someone else. She'd curated the exit to protect herself from discomfort, leaving me to process the aftermath alone. Sex, in that context, felt almost irrelevant, a detail overshadowed by the coldness of strategy. I realized then that I'd been grieving the wrong version of the story. I felt her presence beside me, the tension in her posture, the way she kept glancing at me like she was bracing for impact, and I became acutely aware of the strange intimacy of the moment. She was the only person telling me the truth without trying to soften it, and that honesty created a pull I didn't fully trust yet. There was attraction there, undeniable, but it was complicated by loyalty, timing, and the quiet gravity of shared understanding. I wanted to reach for her, not sexually, not yet, but as a reflex toward something solid. She warned me gently not to use her as a reaction, not to let what we were talking about turn into a shortcut through my pain. That restraint, that boundary drawn clearly and without accusation, only deepened my respect for her. It made the connection feel real instead of reckless, grounded instead of reactive. The desire didn't disappear. It sharpened, contained by intention rather than urgency. When I got out of the car later, the night air felt heavier, but my steps felt surer. The breakup hadn't been a failure of love or awareness. It had been a maneuver executed with minimal empathy. Knowing that didn't erase the hurt, but it gave it shape, and shape made it survivable. I wasn't left behind because I was lacking. I was moved aside because it was convenient. That was the moment I stopped asking what I'd done wrong and started asking what kind of life I wanted next. The thin wall between my old life and my replacement still existed, but it no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like a boundary I was finally ready to cross on my own terms. After that night in the car, something shifted between us. Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded acknowledgement, but enough that I felt it every time my phone buzzed with her name. Our conversations grew longer, less cautious, drifting past the edges of what either of us had originally intended. We talked about ordinary things at first, work frustrations, books we'd half finished, the strange intimacy of living next to people who no longer felt like neighbors, but symbols. Underneath it all, though, there was a current neither of us named, a pull that existed precisely because we were trying so hard not to act on it. We started meeting more often, always in neutral places, parks, cafes, long walks where movement gave us something to focus on besides the space between our bodies. The attraction was there in the pauses, in the way our conversations slowed instead of stopping, in the awareness of how close we were choosing to stand without touching. It wasn't explosive or reckless. It was controlled, deliberate, and that restraint made it feel heavier than something rushed ever could have. I could feel it when she laughed, when she glanced at me mid-sentence, when silence stretched just a beat too long. She warned me more than once, gently but firmly, not to let this become a reaction to what I'd lost. She said she didn't want to be a mirror I used to prove I was still wanted, or a shortcut around grief I hadn't finished processing. The way she said it mattered, not accusatory, not suspicious, just honest. It made me check myself in ways I hadn't been checking anything lately, and I respected her more for it than I was ready to admit. Desire without intention is easy. Desire with boundaries is not. There were moments when the line felt almost laughably thin. Once, standing outside her car again, a different night, a different conversation, the air charged with everything we weren't saying, I caught myself leaning in slightly before stopping. She noticed, of course, and didn't pull away, Didn't step closer either, just held my gaze with an expression that made my chest tighten. That look held awareness, attraction, and restraint all at once, and the fact that she trusted me to respect it mattered more than the kiss we didn't have. I was aware of how this would look to anyone watching, how easy it would be to reduce it to a simple narrative of replacement or revenge. The reality felt nothing like that. This wasn't about proximity or convenience or winning something back. It was about being seen without being edited, about talking to someone who didn't minimize what had happened to me or ask me to make it easier to digest. That kind of connection carries its own gravity, one that pulls you forward whether you're ready or not. Sex hovered at the edges of my thoughts more often than I like to admit, not in explicit images, but in the memory of how it feels to want someone new, to feel that spark without the baggage of routine. At the same time, the idea of crossing that line too quickly felt wrong, like it would cheapen something that had grown carefully out of shared understanding. The tension between those impulses was constant, and I learned quickly that attraction doesn't demand action to be powerful. She told me things about her life too, parts she hadn't shared with many people, frustrations with her family, the quiet exhaustion of always being the reasonable one. Listening to her, I felt the strange balance of closeness without ownership, intimacy without obligation. It was unfamiliar and grounding at the same time, a reminder that connection doesn't have to arrive fully formed to be real. The invisible line between us wasn't about morality or appearances, it was about intention. We were both acutely aware that crossing it would change the shape of everything, not just between us, but around us. That awareness didn't weaken the pull. It sharpened it, turning every shared moment into a choice rather than an accident. One night, after a particularly long walk, we stood outside my house, the glow from the windows next door visible in the corner of my vision like a reminder of what had started all of this. She looked at it, then back at me, and said quietly that whatever happened between us needed to come from clarity, not collision. I nodded, because there was nothing else to do but agree. When she left, the night felt charged in a way that had nothing to do with anger or loss anymore. I realized then that the line we were circling wasn't something to fear. It was something to respect. And for the first time since my girlfriend had walked across that lawn, I wasn't thinking about replacement or proximity or humiliation. I was thinking about choice, about timing, and about how sometimes the most significant crossings happen slowly, one deliberate step at a time. I found out by accident, which feels fitting given how much of my life had been rearranged without my participation. It wasn't a confession or a dramatic reveal, just a sentence dropped casually by someone who assumed I already knew. The way people speak when they think the story has settled. We were standing outside the cafe again, the same one where everything had started, when a mutual acquaintance mentioned how my ex had always liked to see how people reacted under pressure. The words slid into place too easily to ignore. Later that night, I asked her sister directly, not accusing, just tired of circling half-truths. She didn't deflect. She sighed, leaned back against her car, and told me the part she'd been hoping I wouldn't have to hear from her. My ex hadn't just drifted away or fallen for proximity. She'd been disengaging for months, pulling back incrementally to see if I would notice, react, fight for her, or quietly adapt. Living next door wasn't about convenience or passion. It was about observation. She'd wanted to measure me, to see how easily I could be replaced, how much discomfort I would tolerate before pushing back, how compliant I would become if the shift happened slowly enough. The neighbor wasn't the point. He was the instrument. Hearing that reframed everything so cleanly it almost felt unreal, like someone had finally turned the lights on in a room I'd been stumbling through. The betrayal hadn't been emotional or romantic. It had been experimental. What hurt most wasn't the idea that she'd chosen someone else, but that she'd reduced me to a variable, something to be tested rather than respected. My reactions, my silence, my attempts to stay steady, they'd all been cataloged as data, not care. I thought back to the calm certainty with which she'd left, the lack of guilt, the way she'd spoken like she already knew how I'd respond. She wasn't brave. She was confident in her assessment. Her sister told me she'd argued with her about it. had warned her that treating people like that eventually hollowed out whatever control you thought you were gaining. My ex had brushed it off, convinced she was being pragmatic, efficient, avoiding mess. The word efficient came up again, and I felt something in me harden quietly. Efficiency, I was learning, is often cruelty disguised as intelligence. Standing there, the weight of it all settled in a way that didn't feel explosive, just definitive. The question wasn't how I'd failed the test. It was why I'd ever agreed to be part of it. I felt an unexpected calm, the kind that arrives when confusion finally gives way to understanding. Anger flickered briefly, but it didn't stick. Clarity doesn't need it. I noticed how close her sister was standing, how aware I was of her presence, the warmth of her arm near mine, the unspoken pull that had been building between us. Attraction still existed, but now it felt different, stripped of confusion. She wasn't watching me to measure anything. She was there because she chose to be, because honesty mattered to her even when it cost her comfort. That distinction grounded me in a way I hadn't expected. She told me she understood if this changed how I saw everything, if it made me want distance, and the sincerity in her voice only reinforced the contrast. For weeks, I'd been reacting to someone else's framework, adjusting myself to fit a narrative I hadn't authored. Now, that framework had collapsed entirely, and I felt strangely free inside the wreckage. That night, alone in my house, I didn't look at the windows next door. I didn't imagine what they were doing or how it compared to me. The test was over, not because I'd passed or failed, but because I'd stepped out of it entirely. I wasn't interested in proving resilience or desirability anymore. I was interested in alignment. The realization that I'd been observed rather than loved could have broken me. Instead, it clarified something essential. My worth had never been in question, only my willingness to tolerate someone else's control. And once I understood that, the story stopped being about who she left me for. It became about who I was no longer willing to be. After the truth settled, the noise inside me finally quieted, not because it hurt less, but because it made sense. I stopped checking the windows next door without making a conscious decision to do so. The habit simply lost its grip. Comparison requires participation, and I'd withdrawn mine. The relief surprised me, arriving not as a rush, but as a steady loosening, like unclenching a muscle you didn't realize you'd been holding for months. I slept better. I ate real meals again. I stopped narrating my own life as if someone else were grading it. She noticed the change before I said anything, the way people do when you stop orbiting the same center. We met one evening for a walk, the same route we'd taken before, and the air felt different, lighter, less charged by avoidance. I told her I wasn't spiraling anymore, that I wasn't interested in being adjacent to my ex's choices, and she smiled in a way that felt like recognition rather than approval. She said she'd hoped that would happen, not because she wanted me available, but because she wanted me intact. That distinction mattered. I wasn't looking to replace what I'd lost. I was choosing what felt aligned now. Replacement carries urgency and comparison, the need to prove something to yourself or someone else. Choice is quieter. It doesn't rush. It doesn't announce itself. It simply begins when you stop asking for permission. I realized then how much of my grief had been fueled by the idea that I needed to be seen moving on, that forward motion required witnesses. It didn't. Our connection shifted in response. The tension remained, undeniable and patient, but it no longer felt like a reaction. When we sat together, when our shoulders brushed or our knees touched by accident, the electricity wasn't frantic. It was steady, grounded in consent and awareness. Desire didn't flare and burn out. It simmered, shaped by restraint. I could feel it when she laughed, when her voice softened mid-sentence, when silence settled comfortably instead of begging to be filled. One night, standing outside her place after a long conversation, the moment stretched in a way that felt different from before. The pull between us was clear, mutual, and acknowledged without words. She searched my face, not to measure anything, not to test, but to check alignment. I leaned in slowly, giving her time to decide, and when she didn't step back, the closeness felt earned. The kiss, when it came, was unhurried, exploratory, more about recognition than urgency. It carried promise without demand, desire without ownership. We didn't rush beyond that. Sex remained a presence rather than an act, an undercurrent shaping how we moved and spoke, and that patience deepened everything. It was the opposite of what I'd experienced before, where momentum replaced intention and clarity arrived too late. This time, clarity led, and attraction followed willingly. I felt no need to justify it, no urge to hide or announce it. It simply existed, and that was enough. Choosing her wasn't about hurting my ex or proving resilience. It wasn't even about romance in the traditional sense. It was about stepping towards someone who had stood beside me without asking me to shrink or perform. She hadn't minimized my loss, hadn't edited my experience to make it more convenient. She'd listened, drawn boundaries, and waited for me to arrive where I needed to be on my own. That kind of respect is intoxicating in ways sex alone never is. The neighborhood still existed, the proximity unchanged, but its power over me had evaporated. I could walk past the house next door without my pulse spiking, could acknowledge the reality without letting it define me. The test I'd never agreed to was no longer relevant, because I wasn't playing the game it belonged to. I was writing something else entirely. That night, as I drove home, I understood the difference between moving on and moving forward. One looks back to measure distance, the other looks ahead to choose direction. I wasn't replacing a relationship that had failed me. I was choosing honesty, presence, and intention with someone who valued all three. And for the first time since everything fell apart, the future didn't feel like a reaction. It felt like mine. I didn't plan the reckoning, which is probably why it landed with the force it did. It happened on a weekday evening, the kind of ordinary time my ex preferred for difficult conversations because it made them feel smaller, manageable. I was pulling into my driveway when I saw her standing there, arms crossed, posture rigid in a way that immediately told me this wasn't about closure or apology. It was about control slipping and her trying to grab it back. She didn't greet me. She asked instead if I was seeing someone, the question sharp despite the attempt to sound casual. I told her the truth without elaboration, that yes, I was, and watched her expression shift through disbelief, irritation, and something that looked a lot like offense. She accused me of moving on too fast, of being reckless, of making things messy after she'd tried so hard to keep everything clean. The irony almost made me laugh, but I didn't, because I finally understood that her version of clean had never included me. She said she'd expected me to take more time, to struggle longer, to need her absence before finding balance again, and that admission was more revealing than anything else she'd said. She wasn't hurt that I'd moved on. She was unsettled that I'd done it without her permission, that the test she'd designed had produced an outcome she couldn't predict. For someone who'd relied so heavily on observation and control, unpredictability was intolerable. I told her calmly that I wasn't interested in revisiting our relationship or explaining my choices to her, and the calm seemed to anger her more than resistance ever had. She raised her voice then, accused me of betrayal, of crossing a line by getting involved with someone connected to her new life, as if proximity were a rule she still got to enforce. I realized in that moment how deeply she believed she still owned the narrative, how accustomed she was to deciding what was appropriate for everyone involved. The conversation drew attention. Curtains shifted. A neighbor's door opened briefly and closed again. The public nature of it mirrored the way she'd left me, efficient and exposed, and for the first time I didn't feel humiliated by it. I felt grounded. I told her that whatever boundaries she thought she'd set had dissolved the moment she treated me like an experiment instead of a partner, and that my life was no longer arranged around her comfort. Later that night, I learned from her sister that she'd confronted her brother too, not with shouting or accusations, but with the same steady clarity she'd shown me. She told him she was done covering for choices that hurt people, done pretending efficiency was the same as integrity. She drew lines he hadn't expected, lines that forced him to acknowledge consequences he'd been insulated from by proximity and convenience. Family loyalty, it turned out, didn't mean silence. The fallout wasn't dramatic in the way movies promise. There were tense conversations, awkward silences, adjustments that couldn't be smoothed over. My ex retreated from the street for a while, avoiding the visibility she'd once seemed to thrive on. The house next door felt quieter, less performative, and I noticed how little it affected me. Their reality was no longer mine to process. What struck me most was how quickly her attempts to reassert control dissolved once they weren't met with reaction. Power, I learned, requires engagement. Without it, it collapses into noise. I didn't need to defend myself or justify my choices. I just needed to live them. The reckoning wasn't a single confrontation. It was the accumulation of moments where I chose not to step back into a role I'd already outgrown. That night, sitting with her sister, the air between us calm and uncharged, I felt the quiet satisfaction of alignment. Not triumph, not revenge, but the simple relief of no longer being pulled into someone else's framework. Whatever consequences followed belonged to choices I hadn't made, and that distinction mattered more than any apology ever could. The reckoning didn't end with raised voices or dramatic exits. It ended with clarity, with lines drawn and respected, and with the understanding that control only works when you agree to be controlled. I hadn't. And for the first time since my life had been rearranged without my consent, that knowledge felt like solid ground beneath my feet. The ending didn't arrive with a final argument or a decisive moment where everything clicked neatly into place, and I think that's why it felt real. Life didn't pause to acknowledge that something fundamental had shifted. It simply adjusted around me as I stopped carrying what was never mine to hold. The house next door remained occupied, the street unchanged, but the meaning I'd assigned to it dissolved quietly, like a shadow receding when you stop standing in its path. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how little energy I spent replaying old conversations or imagining alternate outcomes. The urge to understand why my ex did what she did faded, replaced by a clearer understanding of what her choices said about her, not me. I no longer needed explanations framed as closure, because closure had come from alignment, from living in a way that didn't contradict my own perception anymore. That internal consistency was steadier than any apology could have been. My connection with her sister unfolded without urgency, shaped by mutual awareness rather than reaction. We didn't rush to label anything, didn't pretend that timing and context didn't matter. Attraction existed openly now, no longer restrained by uncertainty, and sex became part of the relationship when it felt like an extension of trust rather than a statement. It wasn't dramatic or performative, it was grounding, present, and free of comparison. Being with her felt like choosing, every time, not filling a vacancy someone else had created. What surprised me most was how safe that felt. Not safe in the sense of predictable or dull, but safe in the sense that nothing needed to be hidden, tested, or curated. There was no audience, no silent grading of my reactions, no sense that my worth depended on how well I adapted to someone else's framework. Desire didn't feel like leverage anymore. It felt mutual, expressive, and honest. And that honesty carried into everything else we shared. Occasionally, I still saw my ex. Proximity makes that inevitable. When our paths crossed, the interaction was brief, polite, and emotionally neutral, and I could see how much that unsettled her. Not because I was cruel or dismissive, but because I no longer offered her anything to push against. The absence of reaction was not punishment. It was evidence that the dynamic she relied on no longer existed. Control has nothing to feed on when you stop engaging. I realized then that the loss I'd mourned wasn't my girlfriend, but the illusion of mutuality I'd projected onto the relationship. I'd believed we were navigating uncertainty together, when in reality I'd been adjusting to decisions already made. Losing that illusion hurt deeply, but gaining clarity hurt less than holding on to something that required me to doubt my own perception. Truth, even when uncomfortable, is lighter than pretense. The neighborhood returned to being just a place, no longer a stage for comparison or humiliation. I could sit on my porch again, could exist without scanning windows or measuring silence. The thin wall that once symbolized replacement became irrelevant, stripped of the meaning I'd assigned to it in the aftermath of betrayal. Geography lost its power once I reclaimed my narrative. What I gained wasn't vindication or revenge or even a perfect love story. I gained self-trust. I gained the ability to recognize when something doesn't feel right and the confidence to investigate that feeling without apologizing for it. I gained a relationship built on consent and presence instead of observation and control. Most importantly, I gained the understanding that being chosen matters far less than choosing yourself. I didn't lose my girlfriend to the guy next door. I lost a version of reality that depended on my silence to survive. In its place, I gained something quieter and far more durable: honesty, agency, and the steady knowledge that my life belongs to me. And standing there, grounded in that understanding, I knew I hadn't been replaced. I'd been released.